Kia ora koutou, bula vinaka, namaste, kaise. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to be part of this conference. I want to say a big thank you to the organizing committee and a very happy New Zealand Fijian Language Week to you all. My name is Krish Naidu and I'm a senior lecturer in business at Otago Polytech, Auckland campus. And I'm also a consultant and I sit on a number of community and education boards. And in addition to that, I'm the president of Fiji Girmit Foundation New Zealand, which is a community organization looking after heritage, identity, and we do a lot of advocacy work for our people. And I have got a lot of passion, pride when it comes to identity and advocacy for our people. It is a huge privilege to be able to present what we've been doing, in terms of our community engagements. And today, I just want to briefly touch on the issue of identity in New Zealand for the descendants of Girmitians, Fiji Indians or Fijian Indians or Indo-Fijians, whichever terminology you want to use to describe our people. Now, this is a complex issue, the identity issue, but it has real implications for our people, especially in the areas of education, areas of health, basically around policy making. And I will take you into a journey of how this whole thing started. So in 2019, at the 140th Girmit anniversary in Auckland, we put up a demand to the government that Fijian Indians who have been living in New Zealand for so many years, we need to be treated with respect and dignity. We need to belong to a Pacific community, Pacific people's community, and to be governed and supported by the Ministry of Pacific People, just like other people from the Pacific are. Rotuman brothers and sisters, or Itoke indigenous brothers and sisters. There is no reason why Fijian Indians should not be part of Pacific people. And we actually meet the definition requirements, but we continue to fall off the crack. So we were told to meet up with Stats New Zealand, which is the governing body for collection of data. It's a Crown agency. And after the meetings with ministers, we met up formally with Stats New Zealand and we tried to understand why we are classified as Asians in New Zealand. So if you identify yourself as a Fijian in the stats form, census form, then you get coded under Pacific classification. But if you identify yourself as Fiji Indian or Fijian Indian, you get coded under Asian classification. So in New Zealand, we have a number of broad classification, such as European, Maori, Asian, Pacific people, and all people from the Pacific, Niueans, Cook Island, Samoans, Tongans, they all come under the Pacific people classification. But if you're a Fijian Indian, you get classified as Asians. But the funny thing here is this. We all know constitutionally in Fiji, there's been a change, and the word Fijian is an umbrella term to include all of us. And in New Zealand, people do not have an understanding of this. And the Itoke, indigenous Fijian, are perceived to be the Fijians, and people with biological Indian traits like myself, we are pushed under the Asian bracket. But it doesn't stop us from ticking the Fijian box. And this is the irony of the whole thing, is because if some people are already ticking the Fijian box because they've got a passport from Fiji in terms of their nationality, but also people loosely think and identify themselves and perceive themselves genuinely to be Fijian people. So we have got some of our people who are taking Fijian. We've got some of our people who are taking Fijian Indian, who are identifying themselves as Fijian Indian. And we also have some of our people who identify themselves as Indians. And when you look at these stats form, there is an option, and it just becomes easier for people to take Indian. And of course, people might genuinely also identify themselves as Indians. And we can identify ourselves in multiple ways. So that's not a problem. Now, we spoke to Stats New Zealand and we said, look, when people identify themselves as Fiji Indians or Fijian Indians, they don't know that their response will be coded as Asians. And so when we talk to people about this, and people actually, they're surprised, right? Because they don't know how the coding system works. And there is a lack of knowledge and awareness about this whole issue. But the bigger issue is, regardless of what you identify yourself as, in the stats form, in the census form, the bigger core issue is, who are we in terms of our collective identity? And how are we perceived by government agents, by social agencies? Because this is important in terms of policy making. And even though you might call yourself Fijian, are you actually part of the official government Pacific Peoples Framework or not? And when we look at policy frameworks, we look at the data around those policy frameworks, which looks at the Fijian classification under the Pacific umbrella, we can see that the Fijian Indian data is missing. And there is no engagement, there is no consultation with the Fijian Indian people around that. So we continue to miss out on a lot of opportunities, resources, support systems, which are given to the people who are classified under the Pacific people. So we have had a discussion with Stats New Zealand, and they said, if you want to do a review of a classification change, it cannot be done for the next census. We got this answer last year in 2020, and the next census in New Zealand is 2023. So a review can only take place after the 2023 census, which would mean we can only make any significant change to classification from 2028. But personally, I believe it will not happen, because the bureaucracy around consultation, it will take years and years, and you'll never get a consensus from certain groups of people. And it actually doesn't matter. It is one issue. Stats New Zealand's data collection is one issue. The way we are classified and coded is one issue. But the bigger issue is, when you think about people who are descendants of Girmitians, who are they? Are they more Asian, or are they more Pacific? Or do we have multiple identities? It's a blending of identities. And who is the Ministry of Pacific People? Is the Ministry of Pacific People a ministry for Indigenous Pacific people only? Or is the Ministry of Pacific People, which is taxpayer funded, a ministry for all Pacific people, including us? And to me, it is this question that is more important than the ticking box of self-identification data, because people can tick whatever they want. And you don't take your census form with you wherever you travel and say, hey, here's my census form, I've ticked Fijian, or whatever you've ticked. And if you're born in Fiji, or you're a descendant of people who are born in Fiji, if you identify yourself, you feel Fijian, you feel Fijian Indian, you're a Tuman, you are Toke, whatever you are, we are all from Fiji Islands. We've got roots from Fiji Islands. We are from the Pacific, and therefore all of us should come under the governance of the Ministry of Pacific People, which means we should come under the official policy framework, the planning, the strategy, so that we are also part of data collection, we are part of research, we are given the support structure, we are given support around COVID. Our people qualify for education scholarships, which in some universities have got a very strict criteria. You have to be of a Pacific descent. Who is a Pacific descent person? And in some qualifications and programs, you have to be an Indigenous person only to get those education scholarships. And research, for example, around diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, as part of the Pacific health policy frameworks, exclude our people. And it is really sad because we basically have high incidence of diabetes, we know that, stroke, cardiovascular diseases, and some of these are linked to Fiji and our lifestyle. And of course, in New Zealand, suicide is also a growing issue amongst Fijian Indians. So all the policy frameworks around the Pacific people who are getting targeted support, we're missing out on, including our youth. So this is why it's important that we are part of official policy framework for the Pacific people. And just to give you some examples, during COVID, there's a lot of support given for all Pacific brothers and sisters. But we continue to miss out. We're not part of the ecosystem of support. Pacific service providers, Pacific agencies, they do not connect with Fijian Indian community organizations. They do not engage with us. It is so difficult. You cannot just go around begging every provider and telling them who you are and why you should support us, why you should help us. Last week, we, Fiji Girmit Foundation, we collected funds ourselves to help our people with food parcels. And this week is Fijian Language Week in New Zealand, and we are celebrating Fiji Hindi, our Fiji Bath, at our own cost, at our own expense, through oratory and online workshops and videos around vaccination. We shouldn't be doing this. We should be part of Pacific Language Week, just like Fijian language, Niuean, Tongan, Samoan. So the discrimination, which is institutional, which is structural, a bit of unconscious bias, is real amongst our people. And this year, we have taken the issue to mainstream New Zealand media through the New Zealand Herald, through TV3, to Stuff New Zealand, to educate New Zealanders about the issue, to educate also our people about the issue, because it is not something we can just discuss amongst ourselves. We need to create wider exposure. And it is working. We are getting so many emails from people, our people, who are coming out and sharing their stories. And more people are supporting us every day because they know it is not right. It is a human rights issue. It is unfair. And we just hope, that the government of the day will come to recognize us and give us the due respect. It is our moral obligation. It's also a human rights issue. And it's also an issue of our dignity, our mana, our self-respect. Current vaccination rollout for the Pacific people. Again, we are not part of it. And as a community, we have to mobilize our own people. We have to create our own systems to help our people, in terms of communication and engagement, because we are falling outside the Pacific framework. And the list of examples are so long to discuss in a brief presentation like this. But the bottom line is that we are all Pacific people. And the Ministry of Pacific People is not a ministry for only Indigenous Pacific people. It should be inclusive. It should respect diversity. It should embrace diversity. And the Pacific people themselves, the Samoans, the Tongans, and all our Pacific brothers, the literature clearly says there's so much diversity that already exists in terms of language, in terms of culture, in terms of different generations within each ethnic groups. So why not us? We are also diverse, just like you guys. So we are hopeful positive changes will come. And the disadvantage that our people are suffering, hopefully the gaps will be filled. And it's important to note that Pacific people does not imply homogeneity. It's an umbrella term to describe people from Pacific who are linguistically, culturally, and geographically distinct from each other. So the Pacific People's umbrella is already a diverse description of all the Pacific people who come under it. So you might be thinking, how many people live in New Zealand from Fiji who identify themselves as Fijian Indians? According to 2018 census, there is 19,000 of us, which is inaccurate. If you've come to Auckland, if you've been to New Zealand, you know we are here in big numbers. And it doesn't help when some people identify themselves in different ways, which they can, but the data is all over the place. And we need to bring the data together to understand how many of us live in this country and how many potentially, when you add up the numbers from your kids and your grandkids who were born in New Zealand, the numbers is pretty high. It's close to 100,000 easily. Because when you look at the data from the Indian breakdown, at least 50% of them were born in Fiji and the Pacific Islands, which excludes New Zealand. And then you begin to create a story and understand how many of us are here, but the stats data do not show that. And that's something we are working with Stats New Zealand to, and of course with our people, to improve engagement around census and again around census so that we can have greater participation and the quality of data can also improve. So Stats New Zealand is one side of it, but the bigger issue is the government of the day that needs to give us the recognition, respect, and formal endorsement of people who belong to the Pacific. You cannot just say you're Pacific to come to New Zealand as a skilled migrant. We must be part and parcel of official policy framework. And, the examples, as I said before, there are too many examples, in terms of workforce development in health sector, we need to make sure people are culturally skilled. Again, we need to identify the differences between different groups of people, and our people have their own requirements. We've got our own migration journeys, our own culture, our own language. And the fact of the matter is that if we're not part of the system, then the workforce planning will not take our people into account. So research, design, and delivery of service should take into account who Fijian Indians are, because we are a big number. And for our youth, for our young people, it is about a sense of belonging. It is about equality. It is about fairness. It is about their mental health. Identity is important. And the bias, institutional and structural discrimination must stop. It is time to stop. Fiji Girmit Foundation and myself will continue to work hard in advocating for our people. And I'm sure there could be similar issues our people are facing in other parts of the world. And where possible, we need to collaborate and have a collective voice to improve the outcome of our people. Because we don't want another Girmit for people to live in foreign countries. We've worked hard, but our people are also struggling in certain areas, and we cannot take it for granted that all descendants of Girmitians are well off. A lot of our youth, a lot of our young people need support and help. And unless you're given recognition, respect to your identity, it is very difficult to achieve that. Thank you everyone for listening. And I hope to see you all and hear some questions that you might have in the upcoming few days. Thank you.